Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Chapter 7 Listening, Receiving, and Responding. Previously, we've been discussing the components of listening. We started with the physiological, the cognitive, and then the behavioral components of listening. On the very last of the behavioral components, we talked about responding. And while we've talked about how it's very important, we really didn't talk about the different types of responding. And by discussing them and how to do them effectively and how to choose which type, that can allow us to be more effective listeners and improve the quality of our relationships. So let's dive right on in with the overview. There are many different types of listening, from silent listening, which is the most reflective, and going further towards directive, we have questioning, paraphrasing, empathizing, supporting, analyzing, evaluating, and advising. So, where reflective is just taking in the information, directive is giving information while still listening. So, the thing to keep in mind about this is that we should strive to be more reflective in the beginning stages and more directive in the ending stages after we've already gotten the information. So let's dive right in with the first type of listening response, silent listening. Silent listening is attentive nonverbal responsiveness without feedback. When this is most advisable when interjections are not appropriate, and it helps the other person solve the problem instead of me trying to interject. This is actually a lot more impactful than people may believe, because when you silently listen, it draws out the truth in other people so that they have to be the one to try to figure it out for themselves so that they can because the problem is almost certainly one that they are most equipped at solving. So the answer really should come from them. So we should strive to silently listen. This is the most reflective listening style. Next, we move on to questioning. Questioning is reasons is asking questions, but there are many different ways we can ask questions. First, to clarify meanings. Second, to learn about others. So there are open questions which can have a variety of responses, or closed questions which can have limited answers. So, for example, a closed question would be, uh, do you have an iPhone or an Android? An open question is, what do you think about blank? About Steve, about universal basic income? What do you think about us? That allows us to open up the question to learn about each other. Also, we could encourage elaboration. Well, what do you mean by that? Encourage discovery by asking questions for answers and to understand more and to gather more facts and details. So, what are some of the things that can discourage questions? Perhaps a situation where the other person is not listening, or there's a perception that there is no listening going on. Because if, for example, the person is stage hogging, I may feel a bit unable or unwilling to ask questions because the person is already dominating the conversation. There are also counterfeit questions, and this is where we get into the dark side of communication. Questions that can trap the speaker. You didn't like the movie, did you? Basically, setting up that, you shouldn't like the movie. Also, questions that make statements. Are you going to stand up for what you believe in, or what? Or, you don't want babies to die, do you? Also, questions that carry a hidden agenda. What are you doing Friday night? Then, as soon as they respond, oh, nothing. Oh, well, I actually need help moving. So if you can do that, that'd be great. Also, questions that seek a positive judgment. This one is a little bit interesting, but how do I look? This obviously seeks a positive judgment, or saying things like, I look good, don't I? That can also seek a positive judgment. And then lastly, questions based on unchecked assumptions. Why aren't you listening to me? So the assumption is that you are not listening to me, and then I am automatically attacking or asking a question based on that unchecked assumption. A better question would be, are you listening to me? Next, we move on to paraphrasing. So, where silent listening and questioning were very reflective, paraphrasing is also very reflective because instead of offering anything new to the conversation, it is instead rephrasing what the other person has said. Feedback that restates in your words the message you thought the speaker sent. This is to check your understanding. You should change the speaker's wording, offer examples of what the speaker means, or reflect on the underlying theme of what the person is saying. So, for example, if the person says, you know what, I'm really having a hard time with work, and I feel like, the boss just doesn't understand me, and I feel like, no matter what I do, I will never move up. Then, relying on the underlying theme of it, maybe so you're saying that you don't feel very respected in your work. And if that is what they were going for, then they're like, yes. If they don't, then they're like, no. And then I can improve my understanding of what the other person means. Paraphrasing factual information summarizes the facts, data, and details, whereas paraphrasing personal information includes the thoughts, the feelings, the wants of the other person. So now we get a little bit more into directive. We've talked a lot about reflective, where we don't really offer anything. Empathizing is where we show that we are connected. We are providing emotional support, but not really offering any information in that. This is identifying with the other person. Perception or not perception checking, but taking the perspective of another person. Perspective taking. Also, more emotions and perceptions than paraphrasing. So you are actually adding in the emotion and the perception. Offers less evaluation and agreement than supporting responses. So it's not necessarily agreement or evaluating the situation. Instead, it is simply understanding. Listeners are not empathizing when they deny others the right to feelings, minimize the significance of the situation, focusing on yourself, or raining on the other person's parade. In general, these are things that have already previously been discussed, but this is one of those listening responses. Now we move into supporting, and supporting is again communicating something. Now we're getting into more directive behavior. This is showing solidarity with the speaker's situation. This can offer agreement. You're right, your boss isn't treating you right. Offering to help. I can talk to the boss if you'd like. Praise. You know what? You really handled that well. Or you've been handling it well so far. Or you're so good at your job. We also give reassurance. Everything you're saying makes a ton of sense. And diversion can even be, you know what? Hey, you want to go out and get a beer? So, all of which are ways to show solidarity with the speaker's situation, and it in essence agrees with them. So, conditions when supporting is beneficial are when we make sure that this expression of support is sincere, when we mean it. Also be sure that the other person can actually accept support, because sometimes when we are in elevated states of emotion, what ends up happening, we end up being unable to take in information. We just want to feel heard, we want to feel empathy. And focus on the here and now rather than the then and there. So that we should focus in the moment, the agreement, instead of I will support you later. Next, we have analyzing. Analyzing is interpreting of the speaker's message, considering alternative meanings, offers objective understanding, and those are the big three things. What can end up happening, well, in general, there are times when analyzing is effective. But this is incredibly directive because it is saying that this is the interpretation. Here's alternative meanings of what that means, or that this is the way that it is. And when you do that, could be potential problems because your interpretation when uh, uh, when your interpretation is incorrect, that can cause confusion, or there can be a feeling of defensiveness where, well, you're analyzing this situation, but you weren't there. And just like that, that directiveness may be too far. So we should try to offer an interpretation in a tentative way. I think, I feel, I'm not so sure, but when we do that, yes, it's unconfident, but it can be taken better because when you do it that way, what ends up happening? The person then has the possibility to say, well, it wasn't really like that. And then I'm like, okay. And just like that, it is not defense provoking because if I'm offering any analysis, it's only going to be impactful if the other person takes my advice, my interpretation. So some guidelines for this for the analyzing is to offer the interpretation in a tentative way. Your analysis ought to have a reasonable chance of being correct. Also make sure the other person will be receptive to your analysis. And then be sure that your motive for offering that analysis is truly to help the other person and not for your own selfish needs. So for example, if you let's say want to go to Disneyland and then the other person's like, well, you know what, I kind of want to go to Disneyland, I also kind of want to go to Knott's, I kind of want to do this, what do you think? And I'm like, well, you know what, I kind of think that you want to do a lot of these things, but I think Disneyland is the one that you want to do. And in so doing, you're creating an interpretation that would benefit me. That's not what we want to do. We want to be ethical. Now we get into truly directive because we have evaluating. Evaluating appraises the sender's thoughts or behaviors in some way, either favorably or unfavorably. It implies that the evaluator is qualified to pass judgment, and so this can be incredibly directive, and if it is started with, it can create a very defensive response where someone says, you didn't handle this well, or you did handle this well. That implies that I am qualified to pass judgment, and what it could, to a defensive listener, mean is that I am not capable of evaluating my own behavior, or that my behavior is somehow wrong. Well, what gives you the right? So this can get very defensive, and but it is again very directive. Sometimes that may be called for in certain situations, but we should never start with directive listening responses. And the very last and the most directive is advising. It goes beyond just evaluating, it then goes to advising what they should do next. In essence, you are directing them. It is not useful when it doesn't offer the best suggestion, so you should give the best suggestion. Also, it allows others to avoid taking responsibility for their decision. When it allows others to avoid responsibility for decisions. So, for example, you know what, if let's say that, uh, I mean, in general, it's just basically, well, you know what, the person is, the person who passed you over for the job promotion isn't qualified, they don't understand, so therefore, you know what, you should, you should act out that, because, it doesn't seem like, anything you're going to do is ever going to solve this issue, so you might as well just slack off. That wouldn't be good advice simply because it avoids taking responsibility for their own decisions. And when others are not ready to accept advising. And a lot of times that is not the case. In fact, one of my therapist friends, she talked about how it's not so much that she doesn't already know the advice. It's that she has to wait for the other person to be able to hear that advice. So we should consider, is the advice needed? Is the advice wanted? Is the advice given in the right sequence? That did you go through reflective listening styles before you get to advising? And that's very important because how can you give the best suggestion for advice if you don't know the information? Also, is the advice coming from an expert? Is the advisor a close and trusted friend? Are they one of the person's significant others? Sometimes the relational context makes it impossible for me to give advice to you. And is the advice offered in a sensitive, face-saving manner? Because even if it is from a significant other, it can still be taken poorly. Think too your relationship with your parents. Are they a close, trusted friend? Are they an expert? Maybe. But if they say, you know what, you just need to lose some weight, you are just getting super pudgy. At that point, that can obviously come out as bad, and that can create a defensive response. So this begs the question, what type of response should I use? All of the responses tend to have the potential to help others accept their situation, feel better, and have a sense of control over their problems. But in general, we should strive to start with those reflective styles, understanding the other person before we direct them where to go. So we should consider these three factors. First, the situation. Does the situation warrant your response? For example, if the other person is literally asking, what should I do? Then maybe advice would be the most called for, even if you haven't done the reflective styles first. Sometimes you may even want to do the reflective styles first, even in that situation, to better understand it, but advice would probably be the most called for. Another one, the other person, is you also have to keep in mind the other person. What is their style, and who are you to them? By understanding your relational context, you may be able to give a more directive style, or if you do not know them very well, you may instead want to gravitate more towards reflective thinking style, reflective listening styles to understand them more and let them trust you a little bit more. Because listening is very confirming. It in essence says, in a subtle way, maybe not so subtle way, that what you are saying is so valuable that I am spending time to listen to it. And lastly, yourself. What are the styles that you gravitate to? And can we flex different muscles? And if we gravitate a lot more towards advising, for example, then we may have to take a step back and be like, well, I tend to do this one more, so maybe I should be more reflective. Or maybe I'm always very silent listening. Maybe I should add a bit more because there have to be times when I want to be more directive. So These are the three big factors of when we should choose each of the responses, and that concludes Chapter 7, Listening and Responding. Have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you next time.